Oh, you mentioned about funding, but I'm going to say in my example, they do have good funding. They have sufficient funding. Somebody else answered in a question that somebody else answered that needs translation.
Because the customer is not sufficient to cover expenses because it cannot fulfill the customer's needs.
So maybe they can't grow big enough. They can't supply customer demand. So, okay, let's say they are able to supply customer demand, but they don't grow to become an enterprise because they fail before that. So, but I would say that's not, that's more like a effect than a cause, so I'm looking at the root cause now. I want to talk about the root cause. Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. So everybody's familiar with the World Cup football, right? So who gets into the World Cup football? How many teams enter the World Cup football tournament? 32, correct. And then how good are these teams? Are they weak teams or average teams, or are they like the best teams in the world? The best, right? You don't get into World Cup tournament unless you're already the best team in the world. So they're doing everything right. They have the strong team, they execute perfectly, but 32 teams enter. How many teams win? How many teams lose? 31 out of 32 teams lose. The best teams in the world lose the tournament. Only one team wins. Why? How come 31 of the best teams in the world lose? Because of the competition. It's competition. In competition, everybody has to lose. There's only one winner. That's the bottom line. So 32 teams enter, one team wins. 31 teams lose. It's the same with startups. Many startups enter. They're all competing. Only one wins. Everybody else loses. So it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how good your product is. It doesn't matter how good your team is. It doesn't matter how good your execution is or how much money you have, unless you beat the competition. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. I think that's why I started off by saying this is maybe one of the most, I would say this is one of the 2 or 3 most important lessons that we need to learn to become a successful entrepreneur. Success in your startup, it's not just about you. I mean, we have to start with you. You have to start with everything. You need the innovative product that solves a painful problem for customers in a fast-growing market. You need to enter that market through the right niche. You need to own your initial market successfully. You need to expand to the next market and the next market. You need to be able to communicate your value proposition clearly to customers. You need to be able to ultimately distribute and sell your product profitably to customers. Those are all the things that you need to do. But just doing all those things, and even possibly just doing all those things to the best of your ability, doesn't mean you're going to win. What does it mean? That just gets you in the tournament. Now you're one of the 32 companies that has a chance to win. But in the end, only one, or in our tournament, in startup tournament, we might have 2 winners, first and second place, but that's it. There's only 1 or 2 winners in every product category, and everybody else loses. So who wins? How do you win? What do you need to do to be able to win? in order to win, you need to be better than the competition. And you need to be better than the competition in some pretty specific ways. So let's think about this for a minute. This is actually the fundamental business problem that faces every new company and especially every new startup. Now, before I go to the next point, I noticed somebody did type something in the chat in Vietnamese. The last.
But that was referred to last questions. So.
What's that?
It's the best result from last questions.
Still answering the last question, right? Okay. All right. So let's see. Let's look a little more deeply now at competition. So these are the important questions that you need to ask yourself as a startup, considering launching your innovative product into a new market. So where is your competition going to come from, and when will that competition happen? Where is the competition going to come from, and how are you going to beat the competition? This is the scenario that I'm focusing on this morning. We launch our startup, and actually we have an innovative product. It does solve a painful problem for customers. The market is growing quickly. We pick the right entry niche. We get the product into the hands of customers. They like it. We get more customers. We become the owner of our launch niche. We have good execution. We're able to raise some money. We're able to grow quickly. So what's going to happen next? Is the market going to ignore this success? Are potential competitors going to just sit on their hands and wait and see what happens? No. Business markets, product markets are as or more competitive than football tournaments. There are tens or hundreds of entrepreneurs and business people out there waiting for exactly this situation. They're constantly scanning markets and looking for new companies with initially successful new products. And what are they going to do when they find new companies with potentially successful new products? They're going to compete with them. And as a new company with a new product, you essentially have a giant target on your back. The target on your back, like a bullseye that says, kill me. It says, kill me to all potential competitors. Kill me and take the market that I've identified for you. So it's a ruthless jungle out there. And that's the environment that you're going into when you create a new company. So let's think about so we know when the competition is going to happen. Let's say if we encounter all the problems that you mentioned earlier, when I asked why companies are going to fail, you never have to worry about this. If we don't have the right product, if we don't have a strong team, if we don't execute our early strategy effectively, if we can't raise money, you never have to worry about competition because you just die before there's competition. So your company's dead, nothing to worry about. But if you do all those things right, it doesn't mean you're going to succeed. Now, it means that you will now encounter competition, and now you have to beat the competition. And beating the competition, it's actually what business success means. So, okay, now where is this competition going to come from? This competition can come from two directions. What I like to think about it this way: the competition can come from behind, or it can come from the side. What does it mean? Competition that comes from behind comes from startups like you, entrepreneurs like you. So there are lots of stuff. Oh, did somebody have a question?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay, so there are lots of startups and entrepreneurs out there who are probably developing something similar to you, or if they're not developing something similar to you, they're thinking about doing that, or they're developing something in an adjacent space, and they see you launch your product and how well it's doing, and they very quickly pivot to focus on that. So I call this type of competition from other startups or other entrepreneurs, I call this the fast followers. So other entrepreneurs like you. And second type of competition will come from existing players, meaning much larger and better established and better known companies than you. I call these large companies who are in the same space as you, large companies who are not necessarily in the same space as you, but are in an adjacent or related space and find a interesting opportunity in your product. And this is your second, and I believe typically most dangerous source of competition. Because why? For other startups that decide to challenge you, at least to some degree, you're on an even footing, because they're a startup, you're a startup, you have limited resources, they have limited resources, you're both building a brand, etc. But established companies, they have everything that you don't have. They have they have probably some of the top people in the world, because that's why, or in the market, that's why they're number one already, or number two, or number three. They have well-known brand. They have essentially unlimited resources. They don't need to raise money. They have tons of money already. They have many products. You probably only have one product, so they can launch competitor products with very different economics than you. They're not totally dependent on this particular product, and they have ability to scale up very quickly. They may be way up the growth curve already. So existing companies. So as a startup entering a new market, you're going to have to beat both the other startups that want to challenge you and large existing players who are constantly on the lookout for opportunities created by startups. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to beat both other startups and large companies? What are some ideas? How is your startup going to beat other startups and also beat the most successful companies in the world? What's your idea? I mean, since a lot of you thinking about starting a company or already started a company, like, what's your plan to beat the competition? Especially, I mean, how will you beat other startups or spinoffs? How will you beat large companies? Like, just think about who's the largest company in your sector, in your market, and then answer the question, how are you going to beat X? What's your plan to beat X? Okay, so one answer, we found new way to do business. Maybe this is a new business model, right? You have a new business model. Is it correct? Okay, so that's great that you have, I like that. So that's a good start. You have a new business model, but why can't other startup, like once you launch your new business model, everybody's going to see it. You can't keep a new business model secret. So as soon as you launch your new business model, everybody will see it, including other startups and large companies. So once you launch your new business model, why can't everybody copy your new business model? Both other startups and established players. Yeah, okay, great. So we have a digital versus traditional model. That's another, very smart idea. But why can't the competitors all do the same thing? How difficult is it for competitors to also just transform to a digital model versus traditional model? Either other startups or existing players. Why can't everybody copy what you're doing? Or how difficult is it for anybody or everybody to copy what you're doing? So we have a new technology or we have protected it with patents. So, okay, so yeah, that's step one. Definitely one way that we can compete with both other startups and existing companies is with our technological lead. And you can see that's on my slide here. Sustainability of our technological lead. We have a new technology, and this is one of the great things about working with programs like this one, because in our program, a lot of our teams, a lot of our participants will have access to or have developed what I call proprietary intellectual property. And this proprietary intellectual property can take several forms, and we'll talk about those later. But okay, you have some proprietary intellectual property, new technology, and it's been protected one way or another, one way with patents or other forms of intellectual property protection. So I would say that that's a good start, but in many cases, it will not be sufficient. Now, there's another comment. Can somebody, Kim, you want to translate this comment?
The ability to connect, interact, and transparent of all the stakeholders with the new solutions.
So that's good. Again, that can be a big advantage unless somebody can copy it. So okay. I'll continue on this technological lead because this is very highly relevant for our program and also really important. So we have some proprietary technology and we have patents or other forms of intellectual property protection. Does this mean we're going to win? This definitely does not mean that we're going to win. Does it make our competitive position stronger? Yes. But how much stronger? It depends. It depends on how sustainable, this is why I go back to my fundamental topic for this morning is sustainable competitive advantage. So a new technology, intellectual property protection provides advantage, but what we don't know is how sustainable is that advantage. So why do I say that? Let's say we have a new technology that's not patented or is patented. Can competitors duplicate either the technology itself without violating our intellectual property rights or our outcome of that technology? So those are two big question marks about the sustainability of our technology lead. can it be duplicated without violating our intellectual property rights? Or if not, can the competition copy our outcome without copying our technology? So what do I mean by that? Let's say I have a new technology that is protected by intellectual property rights. Customers don't buy intellectual property rights. Customers buy outcomes produced by technology that is protected with intellectual property rights. So let's say that a competitor can deliver the same outcome to customers, but using different technology that doesn't violate my intellectual property rights, then my intellectual property rights value just went down almost, went down tremendously. So when we start thinking about patent protection as our sustainable competitive advantage, now we have to think about how strong is the patent. Some patents are very, very strong. What's a great example of a very strong patent? Usually what's a good example of a strong patent is in drug development. So drug development patents typically are pretty good at blocking competitors because it's very difficult and expensive. In most cases, it's very difficult and expensive to develop new drugs, and therefore when we patent them, they can become very valuable. But let's even in that case, patent or intellectual property may not be sufficient in order for us to win the competition. Like we see a great example of that over the last 18 months. How many companies around the world in the last 18 months have been developing COVID vaccines? Like how many vaccines have been either developed or under development for COVID in the last 18 months? Dozen. In my data, I see more than 100. I've seen more than 100 COVID vaccines that are either under development or being developed over the last 18 months. And how many of those are actually, how many have strong intellectual property? Most. They're all doing it differently, a lot doing it differently. How many are going to actually make money? Maybe 3 or 4 at the most. And this is because why? Competition. There's two, and even if you look at the first 5 vaccines that were developed and launched, there's 2 that are way ahead of everybody else. So even in sectors with traditionally very strong intellectual property protection, your technology and your intellectual property doesn't necessarily make you in. I can see Kim is crying about that. It's okay. Don't worry. I know I'm painting very dark picture, bleak picture now, but we'll get to the, more happy stuff in a little while. So, okay. So, technology is good. I mean, technology lead is great. Innovative technology is great. Intellectual property and intellectual property protection are great, but they don't mean you're going to be successful. They're just a weapon in your competitive strategy, but they don't mean it's game over and you win. So why is that? Because unless competitors absolutely cannot duplicate the technology or cannot duplicate the outcome, you can see, again, using my COVID vaccine example, there were several different approaches to creating effective vaccines, safe and effective vaccines. So just because you had a patent for a certain type of mRNA vaccine didn't mean you were going to win, because we don't know ultimately which approach is going to be the most successful. And customers don't care. In the end, they don't care, is it this vaccine technology or that vaccine technology or the third vaccine technology? They care which one is best for me. Okay, so usually when I ask, okay, so let's say your technology lead and your IP are one way to beat the competition or help you beat the competition. What's another way? Any other way besides your technology or your IP? Okay, what do you think? All right, what I usually hear, anyway, usually when I ask entrepreneurs about this, oh, okay, wait, somebody had to answer.
Oh, the ability of a team and the vision of a team.
You have the best team, right? We have the best team. Okay, now this is definitely something a lot. Okay, you have the best team, right? Okay, of 100 startups that I talk to, how many say they have the best team? How many do you think say they have the best team? I'll tell you how many say they have the best team. 100. Yeah, all. So they all say they have the best team. How many can actually have the best team?
The leaders and team.
Yeah, but again, everybody says like we have the best leader, we have the best team, we have the best experience. Everybody says, but and who's right and who's wrong? But my answer is everybody's right and everybody's wrong. Like everybody has the best team and nobody has the best team. The bottom line is we can never know who has the best team until the end. So it's like this. Okay. Oh, what was that?
His passion for a new solution.
The what?
Passion for new solution.
Yeah. Everybody has. Everybody also super passionate about this. So okay. Let me ask you a question. How many? How many of our participants think they're smarter than the average participant in our seminar? Raise your hand if you think you're smarter than the average participant in our seminar. I know nobody's going to raise their hand, but how many secretly think that is everybody? So everybody in our seminar secretly thinks they're smarter than average person in our seminar. Now, how many people are actually smart? How many people in our seminar are actually smarter than the average participant in our seminar? It's 50%. That's what average means, right? And then how many are below average is 50%. It has to be. It has to be like that. In every group of people, on average, 50% will be whatever dimension we measure, assuming that the quality that we're measuring is effectively normally distributed in the group. 50% will be above, 50% will be below. Yeah, but I mean, maybe, but in the long run, if we measure enough people, it has to be true. That's what statistics mean. So, but everybody's right and everybody's wrong. I think we can't count. The point I want to make here is you can't count on this to succeed because everybody else thinks the same thing, and they're as likely to be right as you. You're as likely to be right as them. It doesn't mean you're right and they're wrong. Doesn't mean they're wrong and you're right. So, okay, but agree, everyone, I 100% agree. Everyone involved in this class is smart. But if we measure, like, okay, let's say, let me put it this way. Let's say we measure the height of everybody in the class. 50% are going to be above average, 50% are going to be below average. It has to be like that because that's how average work. Definitely, if we take the whole population, I agree 100%. If we measure the whole population and compare the participants of our class to the average, everybody's going to be way above average. 100% agree. I'm just saying within our peer group, we can't count on that because within our, just exactly my point, everybody in our class is super smart. And therefore, you can't win by being super smart because all the competition is also super smart. That's the important point. We are super smart, but so is our competitor. So we don't want to start to believe that we're smarter than everybody else. I always want to believe that my competition is just as smart, just as good, just as passionate as me. I don't want to believe that I'm not good, smart, and passionate, but I don't want to forget that my competition is the same. And it's really important to remember. So, and we have a great example in our class. Everybody's smart, everybody's passionate, everybody's committed. So we can't beat others because we're better than them on those dimensions. Okay, so how are we going to succeed? Now, a lot of entrepreneurs that I talked to when I asked this question, actually the first thing they said, nobody said in our class so far. Usually the first thing that entrepreneurs say why they're going to win is first mover advantage. This is far and away the most common answer. We're going to succeed because we're going to beat the competition because we have first mover advantage. Now, why does everybody say that? I think this is one of my theory about this. First mover advantage is one of the small number of business terms that people know. You know, this is one of the small number of business terms that has moved into the general conversation. You know, people have heard this phrase, even if they never studied business, or if they just studied a little bit of business, or they just read an business article, then they might have heard this expression, first mover advantage. So they believe that they're going to beat the competition because A, they have technology, innovation, and B, they have first mover advantage. So I'll ask you a question. Does moving first in a market create advantage? Okay, good. So somebody said yes, first mover has advantage. I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say first mover always suffers from first mover disadvantage. And I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to soften my position on this later, but I want to make the point first. The default position of the first mover is disadvantage. In the absence of other factors, the first mover will always suffer disadvantage. Who has the real advantage is the last mover, not the first mover. Now, sometimes first mover and last mover may be the same, but most of the time, the last mover is not the first mover. most of the time, the first mover does not become the last mover. What does it mean? Who is the first mover? I'm gonna define this way. The first mover is the first company to launch a commercially viable product in a market. So they're the first company in the market with a viable product, commercially viable product. Who is the last mover? The last mover is the company that captures the bulk of the revenue in the first exponential growth phase of the market. So the last mover is the company that becomes the market leader in the first exponential growth phase of that market. Okay, so first mover is first product, and last mover is first market leader in that segment. So let's look at some examples to see first mover and last mover. Okay, who was the first mover in the personal computer market? Who was the first mover in PCs? And no Google search, just answer from experience. Oh, the name of the company. Okay, somebody said Apple, not Apple. It wasn't Apple. It wasn't, somebody said IBM. It wasn't IBM. But good guesses, but it was neither of those two companies. Who was the first mover? Who launched the first commercially viable home personal computer? It wasn't Dell either. Okay, since you got three wrong guesses, good guesses, but wrong guesses, I'm going to tell you the answer. The first mover in the personal computer market was Altair. Altair. After the class, you can Google search if you want. So Altair was the first mover. How many of us ever heard of Altair? Nobody, right? Nobody in our class ever heard of Altair. Where is Altair? How many of us are currently using an Altair? No, they're from, I think they're from the US. So how many of us ever heard of, how many of us are currently using Altair is nobody. Where is Altair now? Altair now is, they're in a very special place. They're in the first mover graveyard. This is where first movers go to die. And that's the most common resting place for first movers. Now, who was the last mover? The last mover was IBM. Who heard of IBM? Everybody. And why did you hear of IBM? And how come everybody heard of IBM and nobody heard of Altair? Because IBM was a last mover and Altair was a first mover. Okay, so that's PC hardware. Let's look at another product category of PC software. So who was the first mover in computer spreadsheet software? First mover. Lotus is good guess, but no, it wasn't Lotus. Lotus, I would say second mover. But who was first mover? Everybody's no guesses after Lotus, right? Okay. So first mover in spreadsheet software was VisiCalc. Okay, so who's heard of VisiCalc in our class? Nobody. And how many of us are currently using VisiCalc? Nobody. So where is VisiCalc today? Yes, VisiCalc today. They're in the first mover graveyard, along with Altair and all the other first movers, failed first movers that you never heard of. Who was the last mover in computer spreadsheet software? Microsoft, that's right. And Microsoft with the Excel. So Microsoft Excel was the last mover in the initial exponential growth phase of spreadsheet software. And who's heard of Microsoft Excel? Everybody. What spreadsheet are you using today? Most of us are still using Microsoft Excel today. So VisiCalc, failed first mover in the failed first mover graveyard. Microsoft Excel, last mover, still the #1 spreadsheet today. So that's software. Okay, third category, PC operating system. Who was the first mover in PC operating systems? First mover in PC operating systems. Everybody's scared to guess. I can tell you, like, you're probably going to guess right at this one. Okay. Okay, I'll take the last guess from spreadsheet software, which was Microsoft, and I'm going to say, yeah, that's correct. So Microsoft was the first mover in PC operating systems. And who was the last mover in PC operating systems? It's also Microsoft. So because who's the market leader in PC operating systems during the initial exponential growth phase? Microsoft. Who is the leader in PC operating systems today? Microsoft. And this is 40 years later. From first mover to last mover, 40-year domination of this segment. Why? What's different? What's different about PC operating systems compared to PC hardware and PC software? What is the special aspect of this market that enabled the first mover to become the successful last mover? So that's the fundamental question that's illustrated in this example. The the first mover becomes the last mover, but only in this category, not in hardware, not in software, but in operating systems. Why? What's different about the operating system market that enabled the first mover to become the successful last mover? And this is actually a great illustration of how this works in general. Okay, so let's, I guess this is a, oh, okay, so answer.
Yeah, ability to connect all the software.
Yeah, so that's a very good answer. The difference between the three markets. So in hardware and software, the reason that the first movers fail to become the last mover is the structure of the market does not enable the first mover to create barriers to entry for followers. So this is the fundamental difference between failed first movers and first movers who become successful last movers. The ability to create barriers to entry for followers. So if by moving first in a particular market, you gain the ability to create barriers to entry for followers, then you have a good chance as a first mover to become a last mover. If by moving first into a market, you do not gain the ability to create barriers to entry, then you're going to be a failed first mover. And that's what you need to think about in your market with your strategy. How does moving first in my market enable me to create barriers to entry for followers? If you can do that, then you can capitalize on your first mover status and you can become a successful last mover. If you can't do that, then you're going to become another failed first mover, because this is what separates successful first movers from failed first movers. What I think we can learn from this is we see now the distinction between first mover advantage and first mover disadvantage. First mover advantage does not automatically accrue to first movers. First mover advantage is an opportunity that first movers have to create last mover advantage. And unfortunately, the vast majority of first movers are not able to do that. And that's why most first movers fail. Now, in this specific case, let's look at why moving first enabled Microsoft to become the successful last mover. And it's very close to the answer that was given in the chat. The factor that, or the force that enabled the first mover to become the last mover in this market was something that we call network externalities. Network externalities. So what does that mean? In certain markets, we have network externalities. Network externalities mean that the actions of one player in the market affect the actions of other players directly, creating a feedback loop. And if a market has network externalities or significant network externalities, this creates a potentially significant advantage for a first mover. Now, how does that work in this case? So if you think back to the beginning of the personal computer operating system market, the 1980s, maybe many of our participants weren't alive or were children back then, but for those of us old enough to remember, you imagine you're buying a personal computer in the let's say 1985. So, or let's say even a little earlier, about in 1982 or 83. You have to choose the operating system. So in the early days of personal computers, there were many different operating systems. And when you chose a computer, one of the it's sort of like today that you buy a computer, there's many different video cards. So you have to get the right video. You get the video card you want in your computer. So back then you had to choose your operating system. So you had to answer the question as a buyer, computer buyer, which operating system do I want on my computer? And how would you make that choice? What would be the most important characteristics of the operating system that you wanted to buy? The most important characteristic would be how much compatible software existed for this operating system. Now, today we don't need to think about that because there's only, even till now, there's only really two operating systems on, effectively two operating systems on almost every personal computer. It's either Windows or iOS, and you just have to think about which one do I want, and pretty much all software runs on both platforms, except in some cases there might be a few users that have a very specific software requirement for software that only runs on one or the other. Now, when we go back in the history of operating systems, we have to realize that pretty much all customers back then were in that situation. So I would say, okay, which operating system, the reason I want a computer, I want to do word processing, I want to have a database, and I want to be able to calculate some math problems. So I want software that will do each of those tasks, and it needs to work with the operating system on this computer. So what does that mean? When you're picking your operating system, which one are you going to pick? You're going to pick the operating system for which there exists the most compatible software. That's going to drive your buying decision as an end user. Now, let's think about the other participant in the operating system market. Who is the other participant? The other important participant in the operating system market is a software developer. So if I'm a software developer back at that same time, I'm thinking, I want to develop a new piece of software. Which operating system should I write the software to run on? And this is a non-trivial decision for you as a software developer in the early days of the PC market, because software development tools were nowhere near as sophisticated as they are today. You would have to write software using very low-level programming, which only worked on a particular operating system. So you would choose to write your software for only one operating system. Which one would you choose? You would choose to write your software for the operating system which had the most users. And this creates this network externality that I was talking about at the beginning. Why? So customer goes to the store and picks an operating system. They pick the one for which the most software exists. Software developers choose which operating system to write their software for based on which software has the most users. So as more people buy the software, more software developers write software for that operating system, which means more people buy it, which means more people write software for it. And pretty soon, everybody buys that operating system, and every software developer develops software only for that operating system. And that's why the first mover in the operating system market was able to become the successful last mover and remain the successful last mover for 40 years. And that was Microsoft. And that's the difference between failed first mover and first mover who becomes last mover. Now, in case you think that this only applies to a couple of markets, so let's look at other examples. And it's not just in tech. This is an example of many different product categories where we can see that the first mover is usually not the last mover. And then we can also see a few examples where it was. So in the markets where the first mover also became the last mover, it's always going to be the case that the market structure enabled the first mover to create barriers to entry for followers and become a successful last mover. So I think you want to think about, how does this apply to your product in your market? If you're going to be let's say you believe that you're going to be a first mover or an early mover in your market, that's great. But what is the competitive strategy that you're going to use to create barriers to entry? In this case, the competitive strategy is capitalize on network externalities. And interestingly, you see, if you think about who is the second mover in the personal computer market, we already got this answer when I asked for the first mover. So the second mover in the personal computer market was Apple. But and also operating system market was Apple. But Apple never achieved last mover status in personal computers or personal computer operating systems or software. But interestingly, Apple used this exact same strategy later to beat Microsoft in another even more important market, which was smartphones. Apple used this, it's almost ironic that the strategy that caused Apple to fail as a first mover in PCs actually was the strategy, that exact same strategy that they later used to become the successful first mover in smartphones and crush Microsoft. Microsoft is a non-player in smartphone market at this point. So how did that work? It's almost exactly the same strategy. Who was the first mover in smartphones? Which company launched the first commercially successful smartphone? Motorola is a good guess, but it's actually Nokia. Nokia launched a smartphone 10 years before iPhone. 10 years. Actually, Nokia created the whole category of smartphone. How's Nokia doing now? Basically gone. They're gone. How many of us using Nokia smartphone today? Nobody. How many of us are using Apple or Samsung or some variation? Everybody. So why was Apple so successful with the smartphone? Exact same strategy that IBM used, that IBM and Microsoft use against them. Apple launched the smartphone. But what was different about Apple's smartphone versus Nokia smartphone? Apple launched smartphone with App Store. And smartphone combined with App Store creates what? It creates network externalities. How? You bought your first iPhone, and when you open up the iPhone for the first time, you realize it's different from other smartphones. Why? How is it different? It's different because it runs apps that you can download from the App Store. And you go to the App Store and you see all the apps you can download and you get very excited. And at the same time, I'm a software developer and I noticed the launch of smartphone. And I think, wow, I can develop apps for smartphone platform. So which smartphone platform do I develop my apps for? App Store for iOS, because it's the only smartphone platform out there. And this sells more iPhone, and this causes more apps to appear in the App Store and causes software developers to develop apps for iOS, which sells more iOS, which causes more software developers to develop apps. So this is Apple strategy to become, actually, you know, Apple was not even a player in the phone market. They never had a phone before iPhone. They beat all the phone players, including the first mover in smartphone, to become the last mover in that market from then until now. Today, iOS, iPhone, and App Store are still #1 in the smartphone market in terms of profitability. Google was able to challenge Apple with Android by developing a Play Store and copying the strategy. But how much money does Google make on their smartphone operating system? Is nothing. They mostly give it away for free. So in terms of profitability, still Apple, iPhone and iOS are the most successful last movers in any market that we can think of in the last 50 years. So you can see here the power of competitive strategies that create barriers to entry for followers. In this case, the network externalities. So let's look at one more example of competitive strategies that create barriers to entry that enable first movers to become last movers. This is another very common and effective strategy used by first movers to become last movers. This one is called network effects. Network effects are slightly different from network externalities. So I'll ask you, what is your preferred instant messaging product on your phone? What is the messaging product that you use most frequently on your phone? Viber and Facebook Messenger. Okay. Just pick one. The one you use most often. Viber. Okay. Facebook. So who's using, okay, for people that are using Viber, why did you choose Viber? Oh, and Zalo. Okay. So, yeah. So, okay, for Zalo user, why did you choose Zalo? Okay, so many users, but more specifically, you chose Zalo because your friend's using Zalo. Everybody chooses the messaging product that most of their friends are using. I don't choose a messaging product that none of my friends are using. I pick the messaging product that my friend is using because I want to message my friend. Now, why did my friend choose that messaging product? My friend chose the messaging product because they chose the messaging product that their friend was using. And why did my friend's friend choose that messaging product? Because that was the one that my friend's friend's friend was using. Now, I can tell you the three that you mentioned here, Viber, Zalo, Facebook a little bit, but let's say Viber and Zalo. In Singapore, nobody's using Viber and Zalo. In Singapore, most people using WhatsApp. And some people using Telegram. In Thailand, nobody's using WhatsApp. Everybody's using Line. So what do we see here? We see the power of network effect. Network effect means that the value of a product increases with each new user of that product. So messaging products are the perfect example of this. Like, the more people that use the product, the more new people that are going to use the product. And this makes it very difficult for you to switch. Like, when do you want to be, you very rarely want to be the first person in your group of friends to change messaging products because nobody to talk to, because most people message their friends. So that's called network effect. And network effect is also very powerful. Now, what you notice, a very powerful way for early movers to become last movers, or first movers to become last movers. Now, what we noticed here was what? There's an interesting illustration when we look at messaging products that these sustainable competitive advantage, it's not sustainable forever, because I bet 10 years ago, you weren't using Zalo or Viber. You're probably using something else. And 10 years ago in Thailand, everybody was using WhatsApp. Now they're using Line. So sustainable competitive advantage doesn't mean sustainable forever. It means sustainable in your early growth phase. Sustainable so that you become the first commercially, the leader of your market during the first exponential growth phase of your market. So those are two examples of competitive strategies that create barriers to entry for startups that we will be able to use to convert our first mover status to last mover advantage. Okay, before I go to my next slide, where we're going to talk about more competitive strategies that we can use to create advantage, we're going to take a short break now. So it's now 10:03 on your side. So we'll take a short break and we will resume at 10:15. Okay, so we'll take about 10-minute break, and I will see you back here at 10:15, and we'll start talking in more detail about competitive strategies to create advantage. Okay, so short break and back here at 10:15. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. I'm going to continue now talking about sustainable competitive advantage. I want to now look in more detail at the potential sources of competitive advantage that come from the strategy, competitive strategy. So we'll look at what are some other ways that startups can create last mover advantage, can convert their first or early mover positions into last mover advantage. Okay, I'm going to start. I'll begin sharing my screen again. Okay, so this is a list of competitive strategies that first movers can take advantage of to create barriers to entry for followers. The list is in two colors because these are general strategies that early movers can use to create last mover advantage. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that are accessible to startups. So not all advantages that are available to first movers will also be available to startups. For example, reputation or preempting positioning. Sometimes I talk to entrepreneurs when I ask, how are they going to beat the competition? How are they going to create first mover advantage, or how are they going to become successful last movers? And they cite the brand that they're going to become number one based on their brand, build competitive advantage based on brand. But this is impossible because why? Because as a new company or as a startup, your brand is not an advantage. Your lack of brand is a disadvantage. Brand comes from having a successful product. The companies that we recognize as brand leaders are brand leaders because they have successful products. You can't become a brand leader without a successful product. It's circular. Our initial success with our first product, in our case, is what creates our brand. And then we use that brand initial success to create more and more successful products. And at that point, we can build on our brand. But it's circular to believe that our brand is going to be the way that we create advantage. We need to use our initial sustainable competitive advantage to build our brand. And from there, our advantage strategy changes. So when we talk about sustainable competitive advantage, this is not a single strategy that you will use throughout the entire future of your company. Your strategies to create advantage will develop over the lifetime of your company. And you can see that, for example, Microsoft strategy and Apple strategy have changed, tremendously over the last 40 years. And so what we focus on in our course is how to create that initial sustainable competitive advantage. And I mentioned in the previous talk, this doesn't sustain forever. That's okay. It just needs to sustain long enough for us to become the market leader during the first exponential growth phase of the product. I talked previously about first mover disadvantage. And on the right side, you can see the reasons that first movers suffer from disadvantage and why it is that most first movers fail. Because why? First movers are subject to pioneering costs. This means that the first mover pays the cost that paves the way for other companies' success. Example, this is why usually we don't see private companies building roads, because only government builds roads. Why? Because once you build the road, you can travel on it, but so can everybody else. So all the people that travel on your road after you build it, unless it's a private road, they receive the same benefit as you, but without paying anything. So that's called a pioneering cost. So the same thing happens to startups. When you launch a new product, you spend a lot of time and money and effort in opening up the market, in educating customers about the need, and your competitors are going to benefit from that as much or maybe even more than you. Early movers face demand uncertainty. We talked about this earlier. Insufficient demand for the product. So we're a first mover, there's insufficient demand for the product, we fail. First movers face changing buyer needs. So it can be the case that the customers of the first mover don't have the same needs as customers of the last mover. So because we were successful with the first movers, but we're not able to address these rapidly shifting buyer needs, we become a failed first mover instead of a last mover. We invest in early generations of new technologies, and this makes it relatively easy for later competitors to leapfrog us. So the first version of the technology is often not the version that makes it into the most widespread use. So because we're heavily invested in the first generation, we suffer when the market starts to grow exponentially. We talked about smartphones before. You can see early leaders in the smartphone market, in addition to Nokia, also suffered because they heavily invested in the first generation technology. For example, BlackBerry. Everybody, I think, remembers BlackBerry. They invested heavily in their own network to provide high levels of security. So early smartphones were not able to do that. And BlackBerry had a very successful early run because they were able to provide security using their proprietary network. But once the market shifted to internet, BlackBerry was doomed because they had a huge investment in the first generation of smartphone networks, which were proprietary, which nobody wanted once internet became available. You can see there both the specificity of investment in the early generation technology and changing buyer needs. Also, first movers are subject to technological discontinuities, meaning the technology doesn't continue to develop in a linear fashion, but either there's a phase change or it shifts exponential growth, and the first mover is not able to maintain their position in the new technology curve, and low cost imitation. So this is something we see all the time. First mover comes out with an innovative product, solving a painful customer problem. They incur all the pioneering costs, and as soon as they establish a need for this product in the market, they're swamped by low-cost competitors. And low-cost means cheap to produce. This can be especially dangerous when the low-cost imitation comes from large companies. So, you can see some many examples of startups who get crushed by large players who introduce less expensive, or in some cases, maybe even free versions of their product. This happens a lot in software. The startup develops a great software product, and large companies knock it off and later even give it away for free. Why can they do that? Because they have many other products that they can make better margins on, and therefore they can afford to underprice their initial version of the product until they crush the competition, and then they can raise the price later. So these are some of the disadvantages that first movers incur, and why I say that most first movers, rather than benefiting from first mover advantage, actually suffer from first mover disadvantage. Then, what are some of the competitive strategies that first movers can use to achieve this successful last mover status? So we talked already about network effects and network externalities. Early movers can also benefit or employ strategy like switching costs, customer lock-in. Switching costs and customer lock-ins come in many forms. For example, one very common pricing strategy and distribution strategy that used by software companies today is software as a service. Why use software as a service? Because when we sell software on subscriptions, this creates some customer lock-in. You notice oftentimes subscriptions are sold on a monthly or annual basis, with the annual basis entitling the customer to a discount. So you sign up a new customer to an annual subscription package with a discount for the annual fee, and they're less likely to switch to competitor software if that competitor software is just marginally better. Because why? Because they already paid for the 1-year subscription. And you notice also that those type of subscriptions are often either automatically renewed or difficult to cancel. So that creates an even longer lived lock-in for the early movers. And unique or favorable channel access. So if you are moving into a market where it's possible for early or first movers to achieve unique or favorable channel access, this can also help early movers to become last movers. And the reverse is also true. If it's very difficult for early movers to secure unique or favorable channel access, then it's likely that the established players are going to beat them. So how does it work? An example of a product category where we see that favorable access to channel is a huge competitive barrier to entry for followers. I like to use example of coffee chains. So if we look in most markets, we're going to see that there's only 1 or 2 successful coffee chains, and almost always those will have been early movers in the coffee chain market. Now, interestingly, Vietnam is, Ho Chi Minh City in specific, and Vietnam in general, it's a unusual coffee market because I think traditionally coffee in Vietnam, it's a local product, and there's a lot more competition in coffee than we see in other markets. But even in Vietnam, we see there are 1 or 2 coffee chains that dominate most of the big markets. They're not the same ones that we see in most markets, but they're still a small number. So for example, in Singapore, there's only Singapore and Bangkok, for example, there's only 2 successful, super successful coffee chains. There's Starbucks and Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf. And Starbucks is number 1 and Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf are number 2 in both of those markets. Why? They also were number 1 and 2 movers in those markets. So how does that work? Why would being a first mover in coffee give you an advantage over later movers. The reason is this unique or favorable channel access. How you think about that is, let's imagine a market where there are no coffee chains yet. So you're the first mover in the coffee chain market in that city. So what's your strategy to create advantage? Your strategy to create advantage, because you have to be not, you have to think the product is not going to do it. There's some difference between coffee, but you're not going to get a patent on coffee. It's going to be many challengers to your claim that you have the best coffee. And it's not that difficult for competitors to produce coffee that is as good or better than yours. So how are you going to compete? In this case, you want to think about buyer behavior. Of course, we always want to think about buyer behavior, but here we can see a very clear case where buyer behavior is the key to competitive advantage. How does it work? Where do people typically, where and when do most people buy most of their coffee? So in most markets, people buy more coffee in the morning than they buy at other times of day. Again, in Vietnam market, this may not be exactly the case because of different coffee culture there, in which case, if we're launching coffee in Vietnam, we want to look at alternative strategies. But in markets where the buyer behavior is common, so people buy coffee, more people buy coffee in the morning. And where do they buy coffee? They buy coffee in the morning when they're on their way to work. Now, again, this may be changing with different work environment, but historically that was the case. So if most people in your market buy coffee in the morning on the way to work, where do you want to locate your coffee chain outlets? You want to locate your coffee chain outlets in very specific places. These places would be the locations where there is the most traffic past your location during the peak hours to buy coffee. So you could identify these, for example, by taking a map of the city that you were planning to expand into, and you could identify the busiest mass transit hubs, and then you could look at draw like a circle of a certain circumference around the transit hubs, and you could look at the places where people are most concentrated working, the busiest commercial districts. So let's say you pick the top 100 locations based on that. And then you put your first 100 outlets directly between the exits of mass transit points and the entrance of popular office buildings. And this creates a very powerful entry barrier for the second player. Because why? Because if you then think about listing from 1 to 500, the most attractive locations for a coffee chain, the number one player just took 1 to 100. And what does the number two player do? The number two player puts their locations, let's say they do 100 locations, so they're going to start with 101st best. So you can see right away the first player has a tremendous advantage because the best location, the number two player, is already worse than the worst location of the first mover. And this phenomenon just gets worse and worse as more players enter the market. The third player's best location is the 301st location, which is worse than the worst locations of the first two players. And that's called unique or favorable channel access. There, you can see a very similar strategy with outdoor advertising companies. Again, there are there are 1 or 2 very successful outdoor advertising companies in most markets because using the exact same strategy and logic. How does that work? If I want to enter a market with my outdoor advertising displays, where do I want to put them? I want to put them where the most people will walk by them during the day and see them. And again, I can pick the best locations to put my outdoor advertising, and then I install my displays there or my billboards there. And once there's a display in that location, competitors can't put a second display in that exact same location. So again, in, for example, Singapore, you see Clear Channel and dominating, #1 spot for these outdoor advertising displays, and then a couple of other players with the second best locations and third best locations. And the same thing can happen if you're selling into retail stores. So this is one of the reasons you see, for example, a couple of companies dominate the market for razor blades and shavers. You see Gillette and Schick again, with a couple of exceptions, dominating markets all over the world for razor and razor blade. Why? Because it's very difficult to get into the distribution channels for these products, and there's very limited shelf space, and the existing players provide very high margins on these products, which they then share with the retail outlets. So it's very difficult for a new company to get the retail outlet to give them some of this shelf space and eat into their margins. The flip side of favorable or unique channel access is favorable or unique access to inputs. So imagine that there is a extremely important and scarce input into your product. And if you can achieve unique or favorable access to that input, that can be a barrier to entry for followers. This might be something pretty more relevant than some of the other ones we've discussed so far for our biotech companies. If there's an input into your biotech product that you have achieved favorable or unique access to, then this can be a significant barrier to entry for followers. Next is definition of standards. So if you can define a set of standards for a new product category and your product actually fits all those standards, this can make it more difficult for followers to compete with you, because you actually define the standards around your product, and actually hopefully you define the standards around features or aspects of your product that are difficult for others to copy. And last but not least, institutional barriers, IP protection, and regulatory approvals. And these last two, institutional barriers like IP protection and regulatory approvals, are especially relevant in life sciences and biotech. So we're going to have another session that will focus specifically on regulatory approvals. So I'm not going to talk about that today. I will talk about IP protection in the later slide. So if we can, for example, just to summarize, I think everybody already is pretty aware of this, but one of the reasons that startup drug development companies can compete with established companies is because of regulatory approvals and IP protection. If, for example, I mentioned earlier these the COVID vaccines that are being developed around the world, and you notice a lot of these are partnerships between established pharmaceutical companies and startups or smaller companies. So you might wonder why. Like, why is it that company as large as Pfizer would want to partner with a much smaller company to launch a COVID-19 vaccine? And the reason is the IP protection and the regulatory barriers. So if you're a small company, if you're a drug development startup and you have strong IP protection in the form of a patent, and if you have, especially if you have proceeded through several phases of regulatory approval, this is going to make it very difficult for large companies to compete with you. Why? Regulatory process is something that doesn't benefit established players over startup. Because why? Because the regulatory process typically takes the same length of time for everybody. If it takes, for example, 5 years to get to a specific phase in your regulatory approval process, it's going to take a big company 5 years and a small company 5 years. If you're a small company that's already through that process, let's say 3 years through that process, then the large company is not going to be able to go any faster than that. They're going to be 3 years behind you no matter what, and they're very likely to want to partner with you than compete with you. So institutional barriers, IP protection also are very powerful strategies, especially for med tech and biotech, life science related startups, to help them beat established players. So I have talked a lot about competing with large companies. Now let's look at this in more detail. So it might seem like when I talk about competing with the most successful company in your product category. So if you think about, you needed to name the #1 company in your product category, who is it and how are you going to compete with them? So you might, as a startup, you might think this is an impossibility because this company, established players have many strengths. I call advantages here. Established companies are further down the learning curve, which means that they benefit from economies of scale. They can produce larger volume of products at lower cost than we can at this point. They have reputation effects, which means that they're a well-known brand, and this is very important in many product categories. They have cash flow, and in many cases, substantial cash flow. They do have economies of scale already, and they may have many complementary assets that help them to compete in the market that you're trying to enter. So that seems like a very daunting set of characteristics and advantages that they have. But every strength comes with a weakness, and there's no such thing as just unmitigated strength. If you are in a position of strength, or if a company is in a position of strength, then this at the same time will create weaknesses, which are the mirror image of the strengths. So let's look at some of those as they apply to large players. The first weakness that we find in large players is it's more difficult for them to innovate than for small players or startups like yourselves. And especially disruptive innovation, meaning it's difficult for large players to innovate as successfully as small companies. And the more innovative or the more disruptively innovative the solution is, the harder it is for the large player to adopt that innovation. And now, why is that? Because if we think about it, if you look at it this way, a company that, let's say we're looking at a market structure or business model innovation, like somebody mentioned earlier this morning. So the #1 player in that market is most perfectly adapted to existing market conditions. They're the leader at the existing business model. So the last thing that they want to do is disrupt themselves. Why would I ever want to disrupt myself if I'm already #1? I'm already #1 in the market, and my company is perfectly adapted to that market. The last thing that I want to do is disrupt this market or disrupt this business model. Like I like to use the example here of the dinosaurs. So when we go back and look at the history of life on Earth, dinosaurs were the dominant life form for hundreds of millions of years, literally hundreds of millions of years, based on the fossil record. And dinosaurs were, except for birds, dinosaurs were totally wiped out 65 million years ago, apparently in an asteroid strike that disrupted the Earth's climate dramatically. So, but why is it that the dinosaurs all died, and except for birds, and who didn't die, who succeeded? The now dominant life form on Earth, we can argue, details about that, but for our purposes, let's say dominant life form on Earth is now mammals, of which we are a member. And who were the mammals back in the days of dinosaurs? The mammals were very small creatures. Maybe they look like current mice, and they mostly lived underground and only came out at night. So why did they do that? Because they were trying to find an ecological niche where they could survive while the Earth was dominated by these massive dinosaurs. Then the asteroid strike killed all the dinosaurs. Why did the asteroid strike kill all the dinosaurs? Was it because the dinosaurs were weak? No, it was because the dinosaurs were so strong. The dinosaurs were so perfectly adapted to the then current environment that disruptive change in environment killed them very quickly. Our ancestors, small mammals, were not so perfectly adapted to the overall environment. They were living in an environmental niche, which is we live underground and we come out at night when the dinosaurs can't see us. But suddenly, when the environment changed, was disrupted, now we had an advantage because we didn't need that much food. We were protected underground, and we didn't suffer when the Earth went into this like many years of night because of the dust that blocked the sun. So the disruptive change in environment benefited our ancestors at the expense of dinosaurs. So this is an analogy for dinosaurs are the market leaders today. They're super powerful. They're extremely well adapted to the current market conditions, but they are also deeply threatened by innovation, and especially disruptive innovation. So this should tell you your first and most important strategy as a startup company trying to become number one in your market is disruptive innovation. By the same token, the existing players need to satisfy existing customers, partners, and supply chain. So what does that mean? That means it's very difficult for them to innovate anything that relates to customers, partners, and supply chain. Because if they do that, they threaten the existing business. Example I like to use about this is Dell Computer. If you think about the battle between Dell and IBM, again, IBM back in the 1980s, they're like dinosaurs. Dell is like the small mammal. And what was Dell's disruptive innovation? It's basically business model innovation, mass customization, direct sale of computers to end users. And you would, at first glance, you would think IBM could copy that strategy overnight. Dell started out with just sending a mail order catalog that allowed customers to customize their computer and have it sent directly to them. So why IBM was the most powerful computer company in the world back then. They could print their own catalog and send to customers in a heartbeat. But why didn't they do that? They didn't do because this would cannibalize their existing customer base, their existing partners, and their existing supply and distribution chain. And they treated this business model innovation as a little glitch, not important, nothing significant enough to dissatisfy all of the key players in our existing value chain. Go direct to customers means we're going to have to cut out our salesmen and our distributors. To customize computers mean we're going to have to disrupt our supply chain. So no interest in doing that until it's too late, until they realize this is not just a bright light in the sky that seems to be getting a little brighter. This is an asteroid that's about to destroy our entire market. But by the time they realize that, it's too late. Dell had already established themselves as the market leader in this space, and IBM eventually exited the PC business a few years ago when they sold their personal computer business to Lenovo. The existing large players will also have organizational structures appropriate to the current tasks and current market. I mentioned earlier that Nokia was the market leader, was the innovator in smartphones, but later totally lost that position to Apple and actually eventually became almost irrelevant as a phone company, not to mention smartphone company. How did that happen, or why did that happen? If you go back and look at Nokia's strategy, in 2006, they decided to refocus their growth efforts away from smartphones toward what were called feature phones back then. Feature phones means dumb phones, just phones that just made phone call. If you remember the dates, so Nokia made this decision in 2006, iPhone launched in 2007, totally transformed the industry. Nokia left with nothing. But why did they make that decision? They're not stupid. They were market leader in 2006. So they were looking at the data, and their organization was built around their feature phone division because that was the biggest market for phones by far. The smartphone market was an infinitesimally small market. The market for plain phones or feature phones was huge, and they hadn't captured most of it at that point. So they said, wow, there's, how many billions of people in the world that don't have a phone yet? We should focus on selling feature phones to that market instead of wasting all this money on smartphones, which only appeal to a small niche. So that definitely, from an organizational perspective, that made sense. From a bigger picture perspective, it was the beginning of the death of that company. And risk aversion. So existing players are going to be definitely more risk averse than startups. And they're going to be more risk averse in some pretty specific ways that can benefit startups. Why will existing players be more risk averse? They're going to be more risk averse because they have more to lose. The more you have to lose, the less risk you want to take. The less you have to lose, the more risk you can afford to take. And this risk aversion leads to another very interesting strategy that startups can use to compete with established players. And I call this operating in areas of legal or regulatory uncertainty. And this is a strategy that large players are almost never going to use, but that startups can use very effectively in a variety, and have used very effectively in a variety of different markets. So let's examine that for a minute in more detail. I call this, I like to think about this strategy in terms of traffic signals. So in our traffic signal, we have three colors. We have the red light, we have the yellow light, and we have the green light. So red light means stop, yellow light means proceed with caution, and green light means go. So let's say we classify legal and regulatory environments into these three colors. Okay, I'm a startup. I'm considering a product that is in the green light, meaning it's clearly legal. No problem, and investors are going to put money into that company. I'm a startup and I'm considering a company that is in the red zone, so it's clearly illegal. Investors are never going to invest in that, so I shouldn't do that. But how about a market that's in the middle, yellow light? So it's neither clearly legal or nor clearly illegal. And you can see in looking at two of the most successful startups in the last 10 years, they both were operating in these type of markets, yellow light markets, meaning not clearly legal, not clearly illegal. Before I get to that, I'm going to look at one of my favorite examples of this is cryptocurrency, crypto and digital currency markets. They have been not clearly legal or illegal since the beginning of these markets. And we saw many startup companies launch successful products in crypto and digital currencies. We were involved with a company back in 2007 that was using digital currencies. This was before cryptocurrency, but this company was operating had decided to launch a virtual currency bank and credit card in a virtual world called Second Life, which was one of the very early virtual worlds with its own economy. So when this company launched, it wasn't clear. They were in Singapore, and it wasn't clear if a virtual bank, meaning a bank that operated in a game currency, needed regulatory approval. If you wanted to open a real bank operating in real currency, you definitely needed regulatory approval. But what about opening a virtual bank that didn't operate in real currencies, but that operated in game currency? So actually, nobody knew. I personally talked to MAS, who is the regulator for the banking industry, and asked them about this back then, and they had no idea. Nobody even knew what game currencies were. Nobody knew whether any sort of regulatory approval was required. So was this good news for the company or bad news? Actually, this was really good news. Because why? Because the startup was able to launch their virtual currency credit card and bank into a market and not have to really worry about competition from, for example, Citibank. So if you're considering launching a bank, Citibank would be a very dangerous potential competitor. But if you're launching a game currency bank in a market where it's not clear whether game currency banks are legal or illegal, Citibank is never going to enter that market. They're going to wait until the regulatory environment is crystal clear. Established companies, and especially in financial markets, don't launch products or services that are not clearly legal with an L. So this is, in fact, one of the reasons that startup companies have been so successful in fintech, because legal and regulatory uncertainty have delayed entry into many fintech markets for years, while established players sat back and waited to see how the legal and regulatory environment was going to go. Because why? Because if I'm Citibank, I don't want to launch a product in a legal and regulatory gray area and then have my reputation damaged when regulation moves against me. If I'm a startup, I'm willing to take that chance, because if regulation moves against me, then my startup fails and I just do a new one, and I don't worry so much about the risk to my corporate reputation. Okay, and now, so anyway, that was my original category: red, yellow, and green. But I realized in the last 5 to 10 years, there's a whole new category, which is orange. So orange markets are markets where the company is doing something that's clearly illegal, but these laws are never or very rarely enforced. So that's the example I was going to talk about earlier. Two of the most successful startups in the last 5 to 10 years are operating in these, have been operating and continue to operate in these orange markets. For example, these two companies are Airbnb and Uber, and in Southeast Asia, Grab. So if you look at for example, in Singapore, and in Singapore and Thailand, there are very strict laws and existing regulations against people renting out short-term accommodation. Renting out their own house or condo for short-term accommodation is either illegal or violating regulatory requirement for housing. But there are hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of Airbnb listings where people are doing exactly this in Singapore and Thailand. And how many people get arrested for renting out their condo on Airbnb is like nobody. Because why? Government doesn't enforce that law. And so I think that's a very interesting development of this legal regulatory gray area strategy for startups. So you find that if you can find a law or regulation that government just won't enforce, that can also be a very interesting area for a startup. Because again, established players are never going to go into that space. But as a startup, we might be willing to take that risk. And this leaves us in a much more open playing field than if the legal and regulatory environment was already crystal clear. So summarizing some opportunities that favor new companies over existing players. Previously, we talked about where are existing players strong. Now we can get a better idea where can startups actually have an advantage versus existing players. So typically we look at situations where existing firms are frozen in the headlights of oncoming disruptive technologies and business model. So this is where the startup actually has an advantage. So if you think about that, another way to think about this sustainable competitive advantage versus established players is from martial arts. Imagine you're fighting in the martial arts ring, and your opponent is much bigger and stronger than you. So what are you going to do? You're not going to, let's say they're bigger and stronger than you, you're weaker and smaller. So you're not going to try to beat them by attacking them head on and challenging their size and strength. This would be suicide. But what do? How can you win this fight? You win this fight because you try to change the basis of competition to speed and agility. You're smaller and weaker, but you're also faster and more agile. So you try to reframe the competition so that speed and agility determine who wins, not strength and size. And that's exactly what startups need to do. You turn the large company strength into a weakness, and then you attack that weakness. So in this case, we talked already, disruptive technologies and business models tend to freeze, especially market leaders, in the headlights of this impending disruption. And that creates a very favorable competitive opportunity for especially disruptive startups. You want to capitalize on uncertainty. So exploiting the fact that existing companies' advantage in market research are neutralized, because typically market research doesn't work well for disruptive product. People will either like it or hate it, and you won't be able to figure out which is going to be more important in the future. And again, uncertainty is much more attractive to companies with a higher degree of risk propensity, which will be startups rather than established players. We want to look at, we want to focus on technologies which are discrete rather than systemic, meaning technologies that don't require systemic change for introduction. So this is why you see very little disruptive innovation, for example, in automobile manufacturing, because it's very difficult to get a single change into a auto manufacturing production line. So you see most of the disruption in automotive comes from companies that build the entire new system. So they don't try to put a change into a system. We want to compete in markets where people are more important than capital. People are more important than money. Because why? Because people are unique. Money is fungible. So we don't want to be competing in markets where spending wins. We want to be competing in markets where specific knowledge and capabilities win. And we want to look at technologies that are more general purpose rather than specific. We would also like to, as a market entry strategy, enter a market that's unattractive to existing competitors due to established cost structure. So what that means is we, as a startup, we can focus on our first market, which is a hugely important strategic choice for us, being based on being targeted at customers that are not going to be profitable for existing players because maybe they're too demanding or they have special requirement. But we can provide better outcomes for these customers and more at a more profitable price point. So we have lower fixed costs than existing players, and we can spend more time on each customer. So looking at, again, if we think about Dell example, where IBM was very focused on corporate customers who were the most profitable for them, but Dell originally focused on home users, and especially home users that wanted customized solutions, which was economically infeasible for IBM to compete at. So summarizing our strategies to create advantage, the competitive strategies to create barriers to entry that I talked about already, and IP strategy, so intellectual property strategy. Now, intellectual property strategy has several components: patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. So before I go into a little more detail about that, I often like to ask startups and entrepreneurs, is it possible for somebody, or should you be worried about somebody stealing your startup idea? A lot of startups that I meet, the entrepreneurs are worried about somebody is going to steal their startup idea. And what I always tell them is, nobody can steal your startup idea. Why is it that nobody can steal your startup idea? Because you don't own your startup idea. Nobody can own ideas. Ideas belong to the world. So what is, you can't steal something that you don't own. That nobody can steal something from you that you don't own. And you can't steal something that somebody doesn't already own. So what does it mean? Great ideas are cheap. What's valuable are intellectual property. So if you have a great startup idea, if it's worth stealing, then you should convert it to intellectual property. Worth stealing means it has some potential value. And then you convert it to intellectual property by patenting it, copywriting it, trademarking it, or keeping it as a trade secret. So if you look at it this way, there's a couple of important benefits. One is you don't have to worry about people stealing your startup idea because your ideas don't belong to you. What you should be thinking about is, if my ideas are really valuable, how do I convert them most effectively into intellectual property so that they can be stolen? Now, of course, that doesn't mean we want people to steal our ideas, but what it means is we want to convert valuable ideas into intellectual property, which then enables us to own it. Property means something that is owned. So valuable ideas, if you want to own them, convert them to intellectual property. So these are summarizing what you should be thinking about for your competitive advantage. How are you going to compete with startups, other startups? How are you going to compete with large companies who decide to move into your space? what is your intellectual property strategy going to be for this company? And what are competitive strategies that you will be able to use to create barriers to entry for followers? So I think everybody in our program should take note of these 4 questions, and you should start thinking of how are you going to answer these questions. Even maybe, start working on your answers to these questions, because if you can't answer each of these questions in a satisfactory way, meaning if you can't come up with good answers to each of these questions, then your startup is going to fail. And then there's no point to even pursue your startup. You might as well just give up now before you lose a lot of money and maybe investor money. So these are some of the very hard questions that you're going to need to answer if you want to be a successful startup. So I would start thinking about each of these now, and see if you can start formulating answers to all of these questions for the startup that you're thinking about doing based on your own intellectual property. So let's drill down a little bit on intellectual property. There are 5 types of intellectual property: patents, copyrights, trademarks, registered designs, and trade secrets. I'm going to focus on the first 3: patents, copyrights, trademarks. Registered designs are only applicable in some very specific areas, so probably not that relevant for participants in our program. So if we think about the first 3 and the last 1, patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. The first 3 are all given by statute, meaning they're intellectual property rights that you acquire through law, commercial law, or national law. So the fourth one, however, and the 5th on our list here, trade secrets, is different. Trade secrets are intellectual property rights that you acquire through keeping something secret, meaning telling as few people as possible. So all 4 of these intellectual property types are important for a competitive advantage. What do patents cover? Patents cover technical inventions. So if you have something which is an invention, then you can consider to patent it. The criteria for being granted a patent for a particular type of intellectual property: novelty, inventiveness, and application. So is the invention that you're trying to patent, is it novel? Is it inventive? And does it have an application? Inventive is, when we talk about novel, meaning is it something new? Is it something useful? And is it something that can be applied? And also another interpretation of this is non-obvious. So is it non-obvious? That's another way to say inventiveness. When we talk about non-obvious, what does that mean? It means that your invention is non-obvious to not an average person, but non-obvious to someone skilled in the art of what you're trying to patent. There are patent registration systems are national, meaning every country has their own patent system. So when entrepreneurs say they're applying for international patent, it's not correct. There is something called PCT, which enables inventors to file for patents in multiple national systems and also EU system. But PCT is not the same as an international patent. You still have to pick which national patent systems to apply in, and you still have to acquire national patents in each of, or EU patent in each of the jurisdictions that you're applying. You typically will search for novelty and infringement. So you want to make sure that your patent is actually novel and that it doesn't impinge or infringe on existing patents. most patent, again, this can vary based on the system, but most patents will be good for 20 years. They provide an exclusive monopoly, meaning you have the sole right to produce and sell your product in the markets where you have patented it. And if somebody else wants to do that, they need to pay you. So things like business methods, computer programs, algorithms, and ideas either are often either not patentable or not advisable to patent. So when you're thinking about whether to patent something or not, the main decision that you usually need to make is when we patent something, we're going to have to publish our patent claims. When we publish our patent claims, anybody who reads our patent application, and most of these patent applications will be available for the public to read, and especially if the patent is issued, then we probably don't want to patent if by reading my patent claims, it makes it easy for someone else who is skilled in the art to accomplish the same result as me, but without violating my patent claim. So a great example of this is algorithms. Often, and especially now with AI and big data, algorithms are becoming extremely important in startups. But most algorithms are not patented, or many algorithms are not patented. They're protected as trade secrets, meaning the algorithm author doesn't reveal their algorithm to anybody else. Now, why is that? Because oftentimes when somebody that's a computer scientist or skilled in your area sees your algorithm, they can come up with another way to solve the problem that doesn't infringe your algorithm patent. Because why? Often the algorithm is based on a unique insight that you had into how to solve this problem. But that unique insight, once given, and once another person that has similar skill and background to you sees your algorithmic solution, it helps them to come up with their own solution that's slightly different from yours, but actually achieves a similar result. We see the same similar phenomenon in recipes. Oftentimes recipes or formula are not patented. Because why? Two reasons. One is the recipe and formula patents are very difficult to enforce, because let's say you have a formula for something, and then somebody else has the exact same end product that's a result of your formula, but how do you actually prove that that end product was produced using exactly your formula? Whoever was producing that product maybe modified the formula to some degree and still got a very similar result. And the same thing where once people see your successful formula, they may be able to create their own formula that's just different enough from your formula that it doesn't infringe your patent, but achieves a similar result. So you see, for example, things like the Coca-Cola formula or the KFC spice recipe have not been protected by patent, but have been protected by trade secrets. Copyright. Copyright protects works, not inventions. So copyright protects expressions, not ideas. There's no protection for ideas. Only ideas can be protected by being converted into intellectual property. And copyright actually exists on creation. So as soon as you create an expression, you automatically own the copyright to that. You do not need to register for copyright. You don't even really need to put the copyright notice in order to own the copyright, but people usually do that because they want to stake a claim to being the first to have made that expression. So you'll often see copyrighted work has a C in a circle with a date. This is the author of that expression is claiming that they're the first one to do it. So things you can copyright include words, music, art, film, sound, broadcast, publishing, live performance. And The term on copyright is life of the author or creator plus 50 years or 50 years, again, depending on the jurisdiction. Trademarks are marks used in trade. There's also something called service marks, but a typical trademark is a mark that the producer of a product puts on their product to keep someone from using the same name or the domain name or the other important mark that is associated with that product. Now, anybody can put a trademark TM next to a mark that they're using. And if you want to have a registered trademark, which is R in a circle, then you need to typically apply to register that trademark. So if you think about where we are so far, patent, copyright, and trademark, most businesses will be able to protect different aspects of their intellectual property with one or more of these IP protection. Design registration design protection is usually a lot less powerful than the other forms of protection because they don't because it only protects specific design. So slight changes in design will make your design registration not valuable, or may make not valuable. So we don't typically spend a lot of time on that. And trade secrets. So I already talked about trade secrets. Trade secrets are different from other forms of intellectual property protection because they're not rights that are given to you by law. They're rights that are given to you by contract. Now, that doesn't mean they're worse or less valuable. In some cases, like the ones that we talked about already, they can be extremely valuable and better, in fact, than other forms of IP protection. There are a few other advantages of trade secrets. So no fees because we don't have to register, no time limit. So trade secret protection lasts forever, unlike the registration system-based protections that we looked at before. And we don't make the information available to competitors so that they can improve on it. So there's no way that anybody who hasn't signed an NDA will get access to our trade secret. And it eliminates a strategy that some big companies use with patents, which is called blocking patents, where companies might file patents based on your patent filing just to block extensions or new versions of your product. Freedom to operate is 100%, and you have a strong proprietary position. So that brings me to the end of my discussion this morning about sustainable competitive advantage. So we looked at the competitive barriers to entry, competitive strategies that enable us to create barriers to entry. We looked at IP protection. We'll cover regulatory protection in a later session. So I have a few minutes left. We have a few minutes left in case anybody has any questions. So I'll open up now for any questions that you might have. You can type into the chat. All right, so if there's no questions, then we'll just, we'll end our session for this morning. Oh, can you share some advice to patent AI model? So yeah, I think the AI model patenting, it probably falls into the category of algorithms. Oftentimes the key to successful AI system is the algorithms that you've developed. And typically we don't recommend patenting algorithms. So I think for IP strategy for a specific situation, to give real advice, we need to look at the specific case. So the general advice is not patenting your algorithms for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Usually, if somebody who is an expert in your area sees your algorithms, it can enable them to come up with solutions that achieve similar results without violating your algorithms. So most algorithms are protected by being kept trade secret rather than patented. If you do have one thing about patents, if you have specific questions about patenting something that you're working on now, we have Expira has a patent attorney in our mentor network who specializes in evaluating startup intellectual property for patents. So we're happy to put you in touch with him. He is a very experienced patent attorney based in the US and has filed patent applications in many countries for IP-driven startups. So if you want to discuss your specific IP and patent strategy for that, definitely let us know and we'll connect you with our IP expert. Thank you. And so if there's no other questions, then we'll end for this morning. Thanks for your great questions and answers and kind attention. And I look forward to seeing you in our next session. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. And stay safe.
Everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.